The rain slashed against Maddie's skin like tiny blades as she ran through the dark Chicago streets. Behind her, Derek's drunken voice echoed through the night. "Maddie, I know you're out there." 3 years. 3 years of his fists, his apologies, his promises to change. Tonight, she'd finally run, but her car wouldn't start. Her phone was dead, and the man who'd broken 2 of her ribs last month was hunting her through the storm. She pressed herself against a cold brick wall, heart pounding, watching Derek's shadow move under the streetlights, searching, always searching. Then she saw it, a black car across the street, engine running, no driver. It was wrong. She knew it was wrong. But when Derek's footsteps grew closer, desperation made the choice for her. She slipped inside, ducking below the window. The leather seats smelled like expensive cologne and danger. This wasn't just any car. This was power on wheels. 1 minute passed. 2, then the driver's door opened. A man slid in dark suit, steel gray eyes, a face carved from stone. He didn't look at her, didn't need to. "You have 5 seconds to explain why you're in my car," he said quietly, "before Silas removes you permanently." A massive figure appeared at the window, blocking the streetlight. Maddie's blood turned to ice. "Please," she whispered. "My ex is out there. He'll kill me if he finds me." Silence. The man's eyes found hers in the rearview mirror, cold, calculating, seeing everything. The bruises on her arms, the torn collar, the terror she couldn't hide. "Silas, check the street." The giant disappeared, returned. Male, early 30s, drunk, checking every alley. "That's him," Maddie breathed. For a long moment, the driver studied her like a puzzle he was deciding whether to solve or discard. Then, "Silas, get in. We're leaving." "Wait, I should go." "No. 1 word. Absolute. Final. You're staying exactly where you are." The car pulled away. Derek's figure shrank in the mirror until he vanished completely. Relief washed over her, then froze solid in her chest. She had escaped one monster, but the man beside her radiated something far more terrifying than Derek's drunken rage. This was control. This was power. This was a predator who never needed to raise his voice. "Thank you," she managed. "You can drop me anywhere." "What's your name?" "Madeline Cross." He nodded slowly, like he already knew. "Well, Miss Cross, desperate decisions have consequences." His eyes met hers in the mirror. "Do you know who I am?" She shook her head. "Good. You can call me Mr. Ashford." What Maddie didn't know, couldn't know, was that Callum Ashford was the Phantom, Chicago's most powerful underground king. A man whose enemies disappeared without a trace. And he had been watching her boyfriend for over a year. Tonight, the woman Derek Walsh had been slowly destroying had just fallen directly into his hands. Lucky or doomed? Only time would tell. What deal did the most dangerous man in Chicago offer a desperate runaway? Like, subscribe, and hit the bell the next will you. The black car glided smoothly along Chicago's rain-soaked streets, then came to a stop before a towering skyscraper rising sternly from the heart of downtown. Maddie lifted her gaze through the window, her throat tightening as she read the blazing letters at the top of the building. Ashford Tower. She didn't know much about Chicago's upper world, but even she had heard that name. This was one of the most expensive buildings in the city, a place only the wealthiest and most powerful could ever set foot in. Silas opened the car door, and Maddie stepped out in clothes that were still damp, shivering in the cold wind. Callum didn't look at her. He simply walked straight toward the main entrance, assuming she would follow. And she did, because where else was there to go? The lobby was quiet at this hour, with only a single security guard nodding to Callum, respect mixed with fear in his face. They went directly to a private elevator in the farthest corner, the kind that required a special access card to activate. Maddie was wedged between Callum and Silas in the tight space, feeling as if she were trapped between 2 stone walls. No one spoke. The soft hum of the elevator machinery was the only sound, and the numbers on the display kept climbing. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. The elevator doors opened, and Maddie stepped into a world that was entirely different. The penthouse stretched out before her like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare dressed in beautiful things. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls looked out over all of Chicago at night, millions of lights glittering like stars fallen onto the earth. The interior was minimalist, yet every object radiated expense, from the charcoal leather sofa to the abstract paintings on the walls that she suspected were originals. The space was vast, cold, and perfect, to the point of unreality, exactly like its owner. A woman appeared from deeper inside, petite, her silver hair neatly twisted into a bun at the nape of her neck. She was close to 60, with a gentle face and fine wrinkles gathered at the corners of her eyes. What startled Maddie was the woman's gaze, strangely warm and tender in this icy place. She looked at Maddie with curiosity, without judgment, then turned to Callum and waited. Callum shrugged off his coat and handed it to Silas without looking. "Prepare the guest room, Mrs. Brennan. She's staying tonight." That was all. No explanation, no introduction. As if bringing home a soaking wet, bruised woman at midnight were perfectly ordinary, Maddie opened her mouth to protest. "I can't." But Callum had already turned away, walking toward a door at the end of the hallway, disappearing behind it without a single glance back. Maddie stood there in the middle of a strange room, not knowing what she was supposed to do next. "Mrs." Brennan came to her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Come with me, dear. You need to get warm and change your clothes." Her voice was as soft as a grandmother's, and Maddie found herself following without resistance. The guest room Mrs. Brennan led her to was larger than the apartment she had once lived in with Derek. A king-sized bed dressed in crisp white sheets, a wall of built-in closets, a private bathroom with a marble bathtub. Everything was perfect. Everything was luxurious. Everything made her feel out of place. Mrs. Brennan took a set of soft pajamas from a drawer. "Change, and then let me look at your injuries." Maddie meant to refuse, but the woman's eyes left no room for argument. She went into the bathroom and peeled off her wet clothes. And when she looked into the mirror, she almost didn't recognize herself. Mascara smeared in dark streaks, hair tangled, and bruises emerging as she slipped out of her coat. A fresh bruise on her wrist, where Derek had grabbed her tonight. An older bruise on her upper arm, already turning a sickly yellow-green, and faint scars across her back, the ones she had tried to hide for 3 years. When she came out, Mrs. Brennan had the first aid kit ready. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't pity her, didn't judge her. She simply worked in silence, gently applying ointment to the bruises, bandaging the scraped places. Her hands trembled slightly when she saw the old scars on Maddie's back, but she still said nothing. That silence, somehow, made Maddie feel more respected than any comfort ever could. What she didn't know was that beyond the half-open door, Callum was standing there. He had come back, intending to say something to Mrs. Brennan, but he stopped when he saw what was inside. Through the crack, he saw everything. Bruise laid over bruise, scars that told the story of years of pain, proof of a life no one deserved to endure. Callum's jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, and for the first time tonight, something other than coldness flickered across his face. His hand clenched into a fist, the knuckles turning white. Then he walked away in silence, letting no one know he had been there. Mrs. Brennan left only after she was sure Maddie was settled, leaving her alone in the unfamiliar room. Maddie lay down on the bed, the soft sheets folding around her exhausted body. She stared up at the ceiling, her mind spinning with everything that had happened tonight. This morning, she had still been a prisoner in Derek's apartment. Now she was lying in the penthouse of a man she knew nothing about, except that he could make a giant like Silas obey without hesitation, and he had enough money to own the very top floor of one of the most expensive buildings in Chicago. She had escaped one devil, but had she just fallen into the den of another? The question drilled into her mind, but her eyelids were too heavy to keep thinking. And there was one truth she couldn't deny. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, she felt safe. Truly safe. Not curled up waiting for drunken footsteps outside the door, not pretending to sleep to avoid another beating. Just quiet. Just peace. Even if it was peace inside a devil's lair, at least tonight, she could rest. Morning light slipped through the sheer curtains, pulling Maddie out of the deepest sleep she'd had in years. For the first few seconds, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was too high, the bed too wide, the sheets too soft. Then last night rushed back like a wave, running through the rain, the black car, the man with steel-gray eyes, the penthouse on the 50th floor. Maddie sat up and looked around the unfamiliar room in daylight. Everything was even more lavish than she'd imagined. From the crystal chandelier overhead to the thick fur rug at the foot of the bed, every detail breathed an almost unreal kind of wealth. She slid out of bed, bare feet meeting the cool wooden floor, And that was when she noticed the wardrobe door standing slightly open. Inside, new clothes hung in perfect order. Maddie stepped closer, her heart beating faster. She took out a cream cashmere sweater and checked the label, her exact size. She scanned the other pieces: a navy sheath dress, straight-leg jeans, a white silk blouse. Every item fit her, and stranger still, every item matched the style she liked. Not too revealing, not too fussy, elegant yet comfortable. The first question drilled into her mind. How did he know? He knew her size, her taste. How thoroughly had he investigated her before last night happened? Or was it all just coincidence? Maddie changed quickly, pulling on the sweater and the jeans. She needed to get out of here. She needed to understand what was happening, and more than that, she needed to know what she'd gotten herself tangled up in. She went to the door, turned the handle as quietly as she could, hoping she could slip away without anyone noticing. The door opened, and Maddie froze. Silas stood in the hallway with his arms crossed, as if he'd been there all night. His face held no expression, but his eyes tracked every movement she made. Maddie stepped back on instinct. "Mr. Ashford wants to see you." Silas's voice was low and even, not an invitation but a notice. "Follow me." She had no choice but to obey. Silas led her through long corridors, past the vast living room she'd seen last night, then stopped before a heavy wooden door at the far end of the apartment. He knocked twice, short and controlled, waited a beat, then opened the door and signaled for her to enter. Callum Ashford's study felt like a private museum. Bookshelves rose all the way to the ceiling, packed with classic leather-bound volumes. A massive desk of dark oak sat before a wall of glass that looked out over Chicago in full daylight. And behind that desk, Callum sat in a flawless gray suit, signing a stack of documents without bothering to look up at her. "Sit down, Miss Cross." His tone was calm, as if she were nothing more than another appointment on a crowded schedule. Maddie sat in the leather chair across from him, back straight, hands resting on her thighs. She watched him sign a few more pages, fold them, and only then lift his gaze to meet hers. Those eyes were still as cold as they'd been last night, but in the daylight she could see the lines of his face more clearly. Hard-edged, sharp, handsome in a dangerous way. "I have a proposal for you, Miss Cross." Callum went straight to it, no small talk. Maddie waited, her heartbeat quickening by a single step. 6 months, he said. "For 6 months, you'll play my girlfriend at social events, parties, charity galas, important gatherings. You'll appear beside me as the woman I'm dating." Maddie blinked, not sure she'd heard him right. "In return," Callum continued, "you'll be fully protected from Derek Walsh. He won't be able to get near you. He won't be able to contact you. He won't be able to touch you. You'll live here, in this penthouse, with every expense paid. And when 6 months ends, you'll receive $2 million to start a new life wherever you want. $2 million. The number spun through Maddie's mind like sudden vertigo. It was money she couldn't earn in a lifetime of work. It was freedom, a chance, everything she'd ever dreamed of but never dared to believe she could have. But she wasn't stupid. There was no such thing as a free lunch, especially not from a man like Callum Ashford. "Why?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. "You could have anyone. Why me?" Callum looked at her, and for the first time there was something in his expression besides coldness, as if she'd said something that genuinely surprised him. "I don't need anyone," he said slowly. "I need someone with no ties to my world. Someone no one knows. No one can dig through the past and find some connection to me." He paused for a moment, "And more than that, I need someone with enough reason to keep quiet about what you see and hear while you live here." Maddie understood at once. She was a complete outsider. No family, no friends, no one who would ask questions or grow suspicious. And she was running. She needed protection. She was backed into a corner with no real choice. She was the perfect prey. Callum set a sheet of paper on the desk and pushed it toward her. "These are my terms. 1. You never ask about my work. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, you forget immediately. 2. You don't tell anyone the true nature of this relationship. To the outside world, we're a real couple. 3. You don't contact Derek Walsh in any form. And 4. When 6 months ends, we go our separate ways. No ties, no contact, no looking back." Silence settled over the room. Callum watched her, waiting. He was certain she'd agree immediately. What other choice did she have? She was running, She was afraid. She needed money and a place to stay. He was offering all of it to her on a silver platter, but Maddie didn't say yes. Instead, she sat a little straighter and met his gaze head-on. "I have my own conditions." Callum lifted an eyebrow. A small reaction, but unmistakable. He hadn't expected this. Maddie caught a flicker of amusement in his eyes, so quick she almost missed it. "I'm not a decorative doll," Maddie said, her voice firm even as her heart hammered. "I have the right to refuse anything that makes me uncomfortable. If there's any request that crosses my line, I can say no without explaining myself. And I want at least 24 hours notice for every event. No surprises, no last-minute pressure." The silence stretched. Callum said nothing, only studied her with a look she couldn't decipher, as if he were reassessing her, reconsidering every assumption he'd made. Then he nodded, brief and decisive. "Acceptable." He stood, came around the desk, stopped in front of her, and held out his hand. Maddie rose and took it. Callum's hand was warm and strong, his fingers closing around hers with controlled power. He looked at her, and in that moment she felt as though she'd just made an agreement with the devil himself. "Welcome to your new life, Miss Cross," Callum said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't decode. When she left the study, Maddie still didn't know whether she'd shaken hands with an angel or a demon, but one thing she knew for certain: her life would never be the same again. The first week passed like a strange dream Maddie wasn't sure she wanted to wake from. As early as the second day, a team of stylists arrived at the penthouse, carrying dozens of bags from brands she'd only ever seen in magazines. They measured every inch of her body, took meticulous notes, and discussed which tones would suit her skin, which cuts would flatter her figure. Maddie stood in the middle of the enormous living room, feeling like a doll being turned and tilted at someone else's whim. Haute couture dresses were brought in, each one costing more than a year of rent in her old apartment. High heels with their signature red soles, genuine leather handbags with gleaming metal clasps, jewelry that glittered so sharply she was afraid to touch it. She tried each piece on, stared at herself in the mirror, and didn't recognize the woman staring back. That wasn't Maddie Cross, the girl who worked at a coffee shop, the one who'd grown used to worn jeans and cheap t-shirts. That was someone else, someone unfamiliar wearing her skin. Mrs. Brennan became her guide in this new world. She taught her how to stand and move, back straight, head high, steps light but sure. She taught her how to speak. Not too much, not too little, just enough to leave an impression without giving away too much. She showed her photographs of the important people in Chicago's upper circles, explained who was who to avoid, who could be trusted, though the list of those who could be trusted was so short it was almost non-existent. Maddie memorized everything, even as her mind reeled under the weight of it all. On the fourth day, while exploring the penthouse, Maddie discovered a room she hadn't seen before. The door stood slightly ajar, and she couldn't resist her curiosity. Inside was a fully equipped design studio. Bolts of fabric in every shade were stacked neatly on shelves, from shimmering silk to plush velvet. An industrial sewing machine sat on a work table, beside a box filled with thread and needles. Two mannequins stood silent in the corner, as if waiting for someone to breathe life into them. Maddie froze in the doorway, her heart tightening. She couldn't finish the sentence. Mrs. Brennan appeared behind her, her voice gentle. "Mr. Ashford knows you studied fashion design in college. Before," she stopped, leaving the rest unsaid, though they both understood it. "Before Derek, before 3 years of hell, before Maddie had to bury every dream just to survive." Maddie stepped into the room, her fingers gliding lightly over the rolls of fabric. The question tightened in her mind. How thoroughly had he investigated her? He knew her clothing size, he knew her taste, he knew even the dream she'd buried long ago. It frightened her, but it also stirred a strange kind of curiosity. In the days that followed, Maddie began to observe Callum from a distance. He left the penthouse at 6 o'clock every morning, in a perfect suit with not a wrinkle, not a single hair out of place. He returned after 10 o'clock at night, sometimes later, with Silas always close behind like a loyal shadow. She heard phone calls from his study, his voice cold as ice as he gave orders, issued threats, or simply spoke words she didn't understand but knew couldn't be good. But she also saw another side of him, small and fleeting. The way he spoke to Mrs. Brennan, his tone gentler, his gaze softer. The way he asked whether she needed anything, the way he rested a hand on her shoulder for a second before leaving. Like a son with his mother, Maddie thought, and that unsettled her more than anything else. One evening, while Callum was in his study, Maddie asked Mrs. Brennan about him. Mrs. Brennan was silent for a long time, looking out the window with a distant expression. "He's not a bad man, Maddie," she said at last, her voice so quiet it sounded as if she feared someone might hear. "It's just that his world doesn't allow him to be good." Maddie didn't ask anything more, but the words haunted her for days afterward. On the last night of the first week, Maddie couldn't sleep. She went down to the kitchen for water, bare feet moving softly across the cold wooden floor. The penthouse was silent at this hour, with only the faraway sound of the city drifting up from 50 floors below. As she passed Callum's study, she noticed light spilling through the crack of a half-open door. She meant to keep walking, but his voice carried out and stopped her cold. "Derek Walsh." Callum said the name, his voice sharp and icy. "Yes, keep watching him. I want every transaction, every call, every person he meets. Don't miss a thing." Maddie's heart skipped. She stood there, not breathing, not moving, afraid even the sound of her heartbeat might reach the room. Derek Walsh, her ex-boyfriend, the man she'd just run from. Why would Callum Ashford, a man with a power that felt terrifying, be monitoring Derek? Callum's voice continued, but she couldn't hear it anymore. She backed away one step at a time, careful not to make a sound, then turned and hurried back to her room. She lay down on the bed and pulled the blanket up to her chest, but her eyes stayed wide open in the dark. Nothing was starting to feel accidental anymore. The way she'd climbed into his car that night, the way he'd decided to keep her instead of throwing her out, the way he knew everything about her, from her clothing size to her abandoned dream, and now this. The fact that he was watching Derek. Something bigger was happening, something she still couldn't see in full. And Maddie didn't know whether she should be afraid, or whether she should find a way to uncover the truth. The debut night arrived faster than Maddie had expected. Only 10 days after signing the agreement with Callum, she received word from Mrs. Brennan that the first event would take place the following evening, a charity gala at the Palmer House, one of Chicago's oldest and most elegant hotels. She had exactly 24 hours to brace herself for the biggest role of her life. That afternoon, the stylists returned, carrying a black gown made specifically for her. When Maddie stepped into it, she understood why people called dresses like this works of art. The silk clung to her as if every seam had been measured to the millimeter. The train long enough to feel regal without getting in her way. The cut was subtle, hiding the scars on her back while still holding enough allure to draw the eye. A makeup artist turned her face into the most perfect version of itself, concealing bruises that had faded, sharpening her eyes, defining the curve of her cheekbones. Her hair was swept up, revealing the clean line of her throat and a pair of diamond earrings Mrs. Brennan brought from Callum's safe. When Maddie looked into the mirror, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. That wasn't the trembling girl who'd run through the rain 10 days ago. That was someone else, someone who belonged to a world of lavish parties and million-dollar conversations. She was still studying her reflection when the door opened. Callum walked in, and in that instant Maddie forgot to breathe. He wore a black tuxedo, perfect down to the smallest detail, from the precisely tied bow tie to the polished leather shoes. His dark hair was slicked back neatly, sharpening the dangerous angles of his face. He was beautiful, beautiful in a way that felt like a threat, like a knife honed to a fine edge and set in a velvet box. His eyes swept over her from head to toe, assessing her the way one inspects an object before putting it on display. "All right," he said. Only 2 words. But Maddie understood it was the highest praise she was likely to receive from a man like him. In the car, Callum sat beside her, keeping just enough distance that they didn't touch. He gave her a quick briefing about the event, his voice steady, as if he were reading a report. "Tonight there will be roughly 300 guests, mostly business leaders and politicians. The most important people are Harrison Pemberton, a longtime partner of my family, and the current mayor. Avoid speaking with anyone named Marchetti, they're competitors. And stay away from the group of women gathered in the corner. They care only about digging into other people's private lives." Maddie nodded, storing every detail. Callum turned to her, his gaze sharp as a blade. "And remember, from this moment on, you're the woman I chose. Act like it." The car stopped in front of the Palmer House, and Maddie looked out the window, her heart speeding up. A red carpet stretched from the sidewalk to the main doors, and on both sides reporters pressed against barriers while flashes burst without pause. Callum stepped out first, then turned and offered her his hand. When she placed her hand in his, he set his other hand on her back, guiding her out of the car with quiet control. It was the first time he touched her, and Maddie shivered, not knowing whether it was fear or something else she didn't dare name. His hand was warm through the thin fabric of her dress, strong yet restrained, like everything about him. They entered the grand hall of the Palmer house in a storm of flashes and whispers. Maddie felt every gaze swing toward them. Curiosity, envy, suspicion. She heard the murmurs around her. Callum Ashford has a girlfriend. That's impossible. Who is she? I've never seen her in our circles. Callum led her through the crowd as if they were royalty, needing to look at no one, needing to greet no one. Yet people stepped aside automatically, clearing a path. When they stopped in the center of the hall, a group of businessmen approached to greet him. Callum, it's quite a surprise to see you here with a companion tonight, said a middle-aged man with a thick belly and an oily smile. Callum gave a small nod and placed a possessive hand at Maddie's waist. This is Madeline, my girlfriend. The words rang out like a claim, and Maddie saw surprise flicker across the faces around them. She smiled and offered the proper nod, Mrs. Brennan had taught her, not too warm, not too cold, friendly enough while keeping her distance. The evening moved on in a blur of conversations and champagne she only touched to her lips for show. Maddie played her part perfectly, laughing at the right moments, choosing the right words, modest when praised but never weak. She could feel Callum watching her from the corner of his eye, weighing every movement, every sentence. Then one businessman stepped forward, his look openly testing. So what do you do, Miss Cross? I don't recall seeing you in Chicago's business circles. The question hit like a fist. Maddie felt cold sweat gather at the back of her neck, certain she was about to be exposed. But then she drew a deep breath and remembered the design room in the penthouse. Remembered the dream she'd buried. I'm a fashion designer, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. I'm in the process of building my own brand, focused on women's empowerment and sustainability. The businessman lifted his eyebrows, clearly impressed by the answer. Callum stood beside her, and when Maddie glanced at him, she saw something different in his eyes. Not coldness, not judgment, something that was almost respect. Midway through the night, while Maddie was chatting with a group of women about next season's trends, she saw Callum step away from the crowd. He moved toward a shadowed corner where a man was already waiting. Maddie watched from a distance, pretending to listen to the conversation in front of her. The man handed Callum a brown envelope, and Callum slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket with practiced speed. Then he glanced toward her, his eyes cutting through the crowd, icy and sharp. Just a second, and then he hid it at once, turning back to the other man as if nothing had happened. Maddie remembered the phone call she'd overheard the night before. Derek Walsh. Keep watching him. Was that envelope connected to Derek? What was Callum doing with her ex-boyfriend? She kept smiling at the people around her, but her mind filled with questions that had no answers. On the ride back, the car glided smoothly through Chicago's night streets. Maddie sat in silence, trying to sort the chaos in her thoughts. You did better than I expected, Callum said, breaking the quiet. Maddie turned to him and met those eyes watching her. Thank you for the vote of confidence, she replied, her tone edged with sarcasm, and then she saw something that made her heart miss a beat. A hint of a smile on Callum's mouth, so quick she almost believed she'd imagined it. Just the corner of his lips lifting, his eyes softening for the briefest instant, then vanishing as if it had never existed. But she had seen it, and it changed something inside her. Back at the penthouse, Maddie lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She realized a frightening truth. That smile was more dangerous than his coldness. Coldness kept her at a distance, but that smile made her want to move closer. And she realized something else, too. She was starting to want to see that smile again. But first, she needed the truth. What did Callum Ashford really want from Derek Walsh? And where did she stand on this chessboard? 2 weeks after the gala night, Maddie had begun to grow used to the strange rhythm of life in the penthouse on the 50th floor. She spent most of her time in the design studio, the one place where she could forget everything and lose herself in sketches, in lines and silhouettes she'd neglected for 3 years. That afternoon she sat at the work table, pencil gliding softly over paper as she drew the shape of an evening gown with an asymmetrical cut. Gentle music drifted from a small speaker, creating a rare pocket of peace. Then laughter rang out from the living room, shattering the quiet. Maddie lifted her head and frowned. That wasn't Callum's voice. Callum never laughed. At least not like this. Not in that loose and carefree way. She set the pencil down, left the studio, and headed toward the living room. There, seated on the charcoal leather sofa, was a man she'd never met. He was younger than Callum, maybe around 33, with wavy brown hair and mischievous green eyes. His face carried a resemblance to Callum, the same sharp lines and squared jaw, but the expression couldn't have been more different. Where Callum was cold and distant, this man radiated warmth and ease. He was talking with Mrs. Brennan, and both of them were laughing at something when Maddie stepped in. When he saw her, the man stood at once, a bright smile spreading across his mouth. "So you're the mysterious woman all of Chicago's been whispering about." He came closer and offered his hand. "I'm Colton Ashford, Callum's younger brother." Maddie shook his hand and felt the difference immediately. Colton's hand was warm, his grip relaxed, without the calculated edge she'd felt the first time she shook Callum's hand. "Madeline Cross," she replied. "I know," Colton said, his eyes sparkling. "My brother has a girlfriend. I almost fell out of my chair when I heard. I always thought he'd married his work." Mrs. Brennan cleared her throat softly, but her look held affection when she glanced at Colton. "Mr. Colton shows up without warning, as always." "I like surprises," Colton said, winking at Maddie. "And I had to see for myself the woman who conquered my brother's frozen heart." They talked in the living room, and Maddie realized Colton was nothing like what she'd imagined an Ashford would be. He was cheerful, open, telling funny stories about childhood and teasing Mrs. Brennan with easy affection. There was no menace, no calculating stare, none of the tension that always seemed to cling to Callum. Around 6 in the evening, the penthouse door opened, and Callum stepped in. He stopped when he saw the scene in the living room, eyes moving from Colton to Maddie, and back to Colton. Something flashed across his face, displeasure, or maybe concern, but it vanished quickly beneath the familiar mask of cold. "Colton," Callum greeted his brother with a brief nod, voice even. "You didn't say you were coming." "I wanted to surprise you," Colton said, rising and pulling his brother into a hug that Callum returned stiffly. "Besides, I had to meet the woman who's gotten you distracted from work." Dinner unfolded with an undercurrent of tension Maddie didn't fully understand. Mrs. Brennan prepared a generous meal, and the three of them sat around the large dining table, the clink of cutlery against plates filling the gaps in their silence. Callum ate quietly, his gaze sliding now and then toward his brother with a guarded watchfulness. Colton, on the other hand, talked without stopping, as if he were trying to push the heaviness back. Finally, when dessert was served, Colton began telling a story Maddie hadn't expected. "Did you know, Madeline?" he said, his voice suddenly more serious. "When our father died, Callum was only 18. Maddie looked at Callum and saw his fist tighten beneath the table. "Colton," Callum warned, his voice dropping. But Colton didn't stop. "Dad left us buried in debt and with a long list of enemies. Everyone thought the Ashfords were going to collapse." He glanced at his brother, something unreadable in his eyes. But Callum carried it all. He gave up college, gave up every personal dream, to protect the family, to protect me. Silence spread across the room. Maddie watched Callum staring at his plate, jaw clenched. He was clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, but he didn't stop Colton. Colton turned to Maddie, his voice softer. "He sacrificed everything so I could have a normal life. School, friends, a future, while he had to face things no one that age should ever have to face." Maddie looked at Callum with new eyes. She'd thought he was a monster, a manipulator, a man without a heart. But now she saw another piece of him, an 18-year-old boy who lost his father and had to carry an entire family, who had to become hard just to survive. Not a monster, but a man forced to shoulder weight far too early. Dinner ended in silence, and Callum left the table to take an important call. When he was gone, Colton turned to Maddie, the playful brightness fading, replaced by a seriousness she hadn't seen in him before. "You like him, don't you?" The question hit so unexpectedly that Maddie went rigid. She opened her mouth to deny it, but no words came. Colton nodded, as if he already had his answer. "I can see the way you look at him." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting somewhere far away. "Be careful, Maddie. My brother isn't a bad man, but his world is." Maddie watched him, waiting. "There are things he has to do to protect what he loves," Colton went on, his voice lower. "And not all of it is clean. He leaned toward her, his eyes earnest. I can tell you're a good person, and I don't want to see you get hurt. So my advice is this: don't let yourself get pulled in too deep. An hour later, Colton left. He hugged Maddie as if they'd known each other for years, and even though they'd only just met, she realized she liked him. He was a warm beam of light in Callum's cold world. When the elevator doors slid shut, Maddie stood by the window, looking down at the glittering night city below. Colton's warning circled in her mind. Don't let yourself get pulled in too deep. But she knew, deep down, that it was already too late. She'd started being pulled in from the first night, from the moment she climbed into that black car, and with each passing day, she sank deeper. What did Colton say to you? Callum's voice came from behind her, making her flinch. She hadn't heard him come close. Maddie turned and faced the steel-gray eyes studying her. Nothing important, she replied, her voice calm. They stared at each other in silence, and Maddie knew Callum didn't believe her. He knew what his brother had said, or at least he could guess, and she knew he knew she was lying, but neither of them said anything more. They simply stood there in the city's glow, two strangers bound by an agreement, and beginning to become something far more complicated than that. Colton's warning haunted Maddie in the days that followed. Don't let yourself get pulled in too deep. But she had already been pulled in, deeper than she dared admit. That night, 3 days after Colton left, Maddie couldn't sleep. She lay twisting on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind spinning with thoughts that had no beginning and no end. Callum, Derek, the strange agreement she'd signed, the life she had no idea where it would lead when 6 months were over. In the end, she gave up on sleep. She needed a glass of water. Or maybe she simply needed to move, to escape the thoughts that were holding her captive. She got out of bed, slipped on a thin cardigan, and stepped into the hall. The penthouse was silent at this hour, with only the city lights outside spilling through the glass walls, casting faint, ghostly streaks across the wood floor. Maddie headed toward the kitchen, bare feet quiet on the cold boards. But as she passed the corridor that led to Callum's study, she stopped. Warm yellow light leaked through the crack of a half-open door. It was nearly 2 a.m, and Callum still wasn't asleep. She meant to keep going, but then she heard voices. Not one voice, but several, low and tight with strain. Curiosity overcame reason. Maddie moved closer, so carefully she could hear her own heartbeat. She pressed her eye to the crack, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice. Callum sat behind his desk, his face ice-cold under the lamplight. Silas stood beside him, with his arms crossed, like a giant stone statue. Across from them were 2 men Maddie had never seen. One stood rigid, his face hard and blank. The other was trembling, sweat shining on his forehead, his hands clenched together as if he were praying. The debt must be paid. Callum's voice cut through the room, cold as honed steel. No exceptions. The trembling man took a step forward, pleading, "Please, Mr. Ashford, give me more time. My family. I have a small child." Callum didn't move. His expression didn't change. He looked at the man the way one looks at an annoying insect. No emotion anywhere in those steel-gray eyes. "You've had 6 months," he said, his tone steady, as if he were reading a sentence. "I gave you an opportunity. I gave you time, and you chose to waste it. The decision was yours, Mr. Garrett, not mine." Silas stepped forward, and the man shrank back, his face twisting with terror. He raised both hands as if to shield himself, though Silas hadn't done anything yet. "Please, I'll find a way, I swear." Maddie stood there, not breathing, not moving. It felt like watching a film, except this wasn't a film. This was real. This was the world she was living in. This was the true face of Callum Ashford. Then Callum's eyes swept the room, and in the next instant he saw her through the crack. Maddie went rigid, her heart missing a beat. She thought he would be angry, that he would shout, that he would throw her out. But Callum did nothing. He didn't change expression, didn't show surprise or annoyance. He only said, his voice as calm as before, "Silas, take them away. We'll talk later." Silas nodded, set a hand on the trembling man's shoulder and on his companion, and led them out through the back door. The room emptied, leaving only Callum and the warm yellow light. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward the door. Maddie wanted to run, but her feet felt nailed to the floor. She stood there, her back inching toward the wall behind her, as Callum opened the door and stepped out, stopping less than a single step away. He was much taller than she was, and at this distance she could smell his expensive cologne, could see every dark strand of hair combed neatly back, could feel the contained power in every movement he made. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice gentle, yet threaded with a quiet threat. Maddie swallowed, her throat bone dry. "Nothing at all." "Don't lie to me, Madeline." He used her full name, and the way he pronounced each syllable sounded like a warning. "What is clause 1 of our agreement?" Maddie felt her back pressed hard to the wall, nowhere left to retreat. "Don't ask about your work," she answered, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to control it. "Exactly." Callum watched her, eyes piercing, as if reading every thought in her head. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then he stepped back, giving her enough space to breathe. "Go back to your room," he said, his tone a touch softer, but still leaving no room for argument. "It's late." Maddie didn't need to be told twice. She turned and hurried to her room, forcing herself not to run, forcing calm even as her heart hammered like a drum. She shut the door, leaned back against it, and breathed in ragged bursts. She had just watched Callum Ashford threaten a man. She had just seen the dark side she'd always known existed, but had never witnessed with her own eyes. She should have been afraid. She should have wanted to run, the way she'd run from Derek. But when she lay down, pulled the blanket to her chest, Maddie realized something strange. She wasn't afraid of Callum, not in the way she'd lived in fear of Derek for 3 years. Derek hit her when he was drunk, when he lost control, when there was no reason at all. He lashed out over cold dinner, over her being 5 minutes late, over having a bad day at work. Derek's violence was chaos, senseless, unpredictable. But Callum was different. Callum was dangerous. She couldn't deny that. But he was dangerous in a controlled way, a principled way, a way that had reasons. He didn't hit that man. He didn't scream, didn't lose control, didn't let emotion take the wheel. He only spoke, and his words carried enough power to make a grown man tremble. That was the difference, and the difference mattered more than Maddie had expected. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and faced a truth more frightening than anything she'd seen tonight. She wasn't afraid of Callum Ashford. What she was afraid of was herself, because she was starting to trust a man she didn't understand. She was starting to find safety in the orbit of a man the world called the Ghost, and she didn't know whether that made her smart, or whether it made her a fool repeating an old mistake in a different shape. 1 week after the night Maddie witnessed the meeting in Callum's study, Callum told her about an important dinner. Unlike the previous events with hundreds of guests, this would be a private meal with just one person, Harrison Pemberton, Callum said as they sat in the car on the way to the restaurant. "A longtime business partner of my family, one of the most important people you'll meet." He gave his usual brief, clipped summary, but Maddie noticed something different in his voice, not entirely cold the way it usually was. There was something closer to respect, maybe even affection, when he said the name Pemberton. The restaurant, Alinea, was in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, one of Chicago's highest-ranked dining rooms with 3 Michelin stars. Maddie had heard of it, one of the finest culinary destinations in the United States, where getting a reservation could take months. But with Callum Ashford, they were escorted into a private room immediately. No waiting, no explanations. Maddie wore an elegant navy dress with a bateau neckline and long sleeves, paired with the pearl set Mrs. Brennan had chosen for her. Not as dazzling as the gala looks, but refined enough to signal status. She'd learned that in this world, sometimes less really was more. Harrison Pemberton was already seated in the private room when they arrived. He was a man around 62, white hair combed neatly back, a kind face with wrinkles gathered at the corners of his eyes. The first thing Maddie noticed was his smile, warm and sincere in a way she rarely saw among Chicago's elite. He stood the moment they entered, and the next thing that surprised her was how he greeted Callum. "Callum, my boy." He opened his arms, then stopped and laughed at himself. No, I should say Callum, the man. I keep forgetting you're not that 10-year-old kid running around your father's office anymore." Callum shook his hand, and Maddie saw something unusual. He wasn't entirely cold the way he normally was. It wasn't that he became warm, but something softened in his posture, as if Harrison Pemberton was one of the very few people allowed to see a different version of Callum Ashford. "And this must be Madeline I've been hearing so much about," Harrison said, turning to her, his smile still bright. "Callum, with a girlfriend. If your father were still alive, he'd be so happy." Maddie smiled and shook his hand. Unlike the calculating, assessing handshakes she'd grown used to, Harrison Pemberton's grip was warm and genuine. He looked at her with curiosity but no judgment, and Maddie realized he was the first person in Callum's world she felt she might be able to trust. Dinner unfolded in an ease she hadn't felt at any event before. Harrison told stories from the past, about his friendship with Callum's father, about the early days of building their business empire. He spoke of 10-year-old Callum racing around the office, mischievous but unnervingly smart. He talked about how proud Callum's father had been, about the plans he'd made for Callum's future before everything changed. He would be proud of his son, Harrison said, his voice lowering with longing, of both of them. Callum and Colton have become remarkable men. Callum stayed silent, but Maddie saw something shift in his eyes. Not the everyday coldness, but something deeper, more painful, hidden behind that steel mask. She understood then that to Callum, Harrison Pemberton wasn't just a business partner. He was the last link to Callum's father, to a past Callum had lost. Dinner continued with delicate courses and gentle conversation. Then Harrison changed the subject and mentioned his company. Pemberton Financial is doing very well, he said, taking a sip of wine. I did hire a new employee, works incredibly hard. Derek Walsh, I believe. He's managing some of my important accounts. The kid has potential. Time seemed to stop. Maddie felt her blood turn to ice, her hand clenching the napkin under the table until her knuckles went white. Derek Walsh. Her ex-boyfriend. The man who'd turned 3 years of her life into hell, working for Harrison Pemberton, Callum's partner. She felt Callum's hand cover hers beneath the table. A light squeeze, a silent warning. Don't react. Don't let it show. Yes, I've heard of him, Callum said, his voice perfectly calm, not a ripple in it. I hear he's quite capable. Maddie swallowed and forced herself to smile and nod, as if the name Derek Walsh meant nothing at all. She made it through the rest of dinner on a brittle kind of composure, answering Harrison's questions with a practiced smile, while her mind whirled with 1,000 unanswered questions. On the drive back, the car glided through Chicago's night streets. A strained silence filled the space, heavy enough that Maddie could barely breathe. Finally, she couldn't hold it in. You knew Derek works for Pemberton, she said, her voice steady but cold. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Callum didn't deny it. He stared ahead, his face unreadable. I know many things, Miss Cross. Maddie turned toward him, anger beginning to rise in her chest. Is that why you kept me here? Because of Derek. Callum finally looked at her. Those steel-gray eyes didn't shift, didn't reveal anything. Don't ask questions you're not ready to hear the answers to. Then he looked away, ending the conversation. Maddie stared out the window as the city slid past in darkness. Neon lights flickered. High rises stood like silent monuments. Life continued outside while her own world tilted off its axis. None of it was coincidence. The way she'd climbed into Callum's car that night, the way he'd kept her, the deal he'd offered, all of it connected to Derek. She was a chess piece in a game whose rules she didn't understand. The question was, what game was Callum Ashford playing? And more than that, which side of the board was she on? After the dinner with Harrison Pemberton, Maddie spent days thinking about the connection between Callum and Derek. She searched for answers in every gesture, every look from Callum, but this man was a sealed book she couldn't read. Gradually, when no new clues appeared, she began to let go of the tension and allow life in the penthouse to carry her along. The second month passed, and something strange happened. Maddie and Callum began to fall into routines no one ever spoke about, yet both of them obeyed. On mornings when Callum didn't have to leave too early, they ate breakfast together in the large dining room that faced the city. He sat at the head of the table, reading the news on his tablet, a cup of black coffee without sugar steaming beside him. She sat across from him with her sketchbook open, pencil moving lightly over the page. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was no longer tight the way it had been at the beginning. It was the comfortable silence of two people who had grown used to each other's presence. One morning, as Maddie sketched a cocktail dress with an asymmetrical cut, she felt Callum's gaze on her. She looked up and caught him watching her notebook. "How is it going?" he asked, his voice still even, but with something in it Maddie couldn't name. Not polite social talk, but real interest. She wasn't used to that from him. "I'm developing my first collection," she answered, a little surprised by the question. 12 designs. I want to focus on women who are strong, but still want to feel soft. Callum nodded, eyes scanning the sketch. "You have talent," he said after a moment of silence. "Don't waste it." Then he stood, put on his suit jacket, and left as he always did. But the words stayed with Maddie all day, warm and unexpected in a way she hadn't seen coming. Over the following weeks, she found herself noticing Callum more, not to hunt for clues about Derek or whatever secret plan he was running, but simply to understand him. She began to see small things she'd overlooked before. He read philosophy late at night, thick volumes of Nietzsche and Marcus Aurelius scattered through his study. He liked black coffee without sugar, and he hated anything sweet. Mrs. Brennan once set a plate of cookies on his desk, and Maddie watched him slide it aside with a displeasure he tried to hide. But what surprised her most was the way Callum treated Mrs. Brennan. To everyone else, he was the ghost, cold and distant. But with the silver-haired housekeeper, his voice softened in a way Maddie had never heard. He asked whether she needed anything. He reminded her to rest when she worked too late. He even sat and listened to her talk about her grandson with a patience Maddie didn't think he possessed. Like a son with his mother, Maddie realized. And that began to change the image of Callum in her mind. One night, in the 3rd week of the 2nd month, Maddie couldn't sleep again. She'd grown used to insomnia, the after effect of 3 years of living in fear with Derek. She got out of bed, planning to go to the kitchen for a glass of warm milk, but as she passed the living room, she stopped. Piano music drifted through the silent night. The melody was soft, sorrowful, familiar. Clair de Lune, by Debussy. Maddie moved to the living room doorway, and what she saw made her forget to breathe. Callum sat at the glossy black grand piano she'd never seen anyone touch. He wasn't wearing his usual suit, only a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, the collar open. The dark hair that was normally slicked neatly back was slightly tousled now, a few strands fallen onto his forehead. In the dim light of the living room, he looked entirely different. No longer Chicago's terrifying ghost, no longer the powerful man with steel-cold eyes, just a man playing piano in the late hours, his fingers moving over the keys with a gentleness she hadn't believed he was capable of. For the first time, he looked like an ordinary human being. Maddie stood there a long time, listening. Then she stepped inside, so softly she thought he wouldn't hear, but he knew she was there. She saw his shoulders tense for a second, then loosen. He didn't stop. He didn't turn to look at her. He simply kept playing, as if her presence were normal, as if she belonged here. She sat on a nearby chair and listened in silence. Clair de Lune poured into the room, sorrowful and beautiful at the same time. Maddie closed her eyes and let the music take her, and in that moment she forgot everything. She forgot the agreement, forgot Derek, forgot the questions with no answers. There was only the piano, and the presence of the man playing it. The piece ended, and silence filled the room. Callum sat motionless at the instrument, his fingers still resting on the keys. A long while passed before he spoke. "My mother taught me." His voice was light, almost a whisper. "Before she died." Maddie said nothing. She didn't know what to say. This was the first time Callum had shared something personal with her, something truly from inside him. She was afraid that if she said anything, he would close the door he had just cracked open. So she simply sat there in silence, letting him know she was listening. Silence wrapped around them, but it wasn't the tense silence of the early days. It was a warm silence, the silence of two people sharing a moment without needing words. At last, Callum stood and closed the piano lid. "You should go to sleep," he said, his voice returning to normal. "It's late." Maddie nodded and stood. When he passed her on the way out, he stopped. Only for a second. He didn't speak, he didn't touch her. But he looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes weren't cold, not warm, not gentle, but there was something there, something Maddie couldn't name. Maybe acknowledgement, maybe trust, maybe something neither of them dared to call by its true name. Then he walked away, disappearing into the hallway's darkness, leaving Maddie standing there with a heart gone unsteady. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the strange fast beat beneath her palm, and she understood a frightening truth. She was starting to see Callum Ashford as a person, not a monster. She was starting to glimpse the pieces hidden behind the steel mask. She was starting to care, and that changed everything. After the night she heard Callum play the piano, their relationship shifted in a subtle way they both felt but neither of them named. They still kept their distance, still followed the terms of the agreement, but something in the air between them had changed. Looks that lasted a second longer, silences that felt easier, and sometimes, only sometimes, Maddie caught Callum watching her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The next event on their schedule was the opening of an art exhibition at a prestigious gallery in River North. A famous French painter was unveiling his newest collection, and all of Chicago's upper circles poured in, hungry to be seen and mentioned. Maddie wore a silver gown that shimmered, the cut simple but refined, flattering her figure with quiet elegance. Callum, as always, was in a flawless black suit without a single crease. When they entered the gallery hand in hand, Maddie realized something. She no longer had to try to play the part, standing beside Callum, letting him place a hand on her back, smiling and talking as if they were truly a couple. It had all started to feel natural in a way that frightened her. They moved through the gallery, studying abstract paintings alive with bold blocks of color. Maddie stopped before a large canvas, layers of blue blending into deep violet, creating a feeling that was both mournful and hopeful. She was absorbed in it when a voice sounded beside her. "You have a good eye. This one is one of my favorites in the collection." Maddie turned and saw a young man standing close. He looked about 30, with wavy brown hair in a loose artist's style, bright green eyes, and a charming smile. From the way he dressed and the confidence with which he spoke about the work, Maddie guessed he was one of the artists exhibiting here. "I'm Tristan," he said, offering his hand, his smile widening. "I noticed you the moment you walked in. You look like someone who's actually here to see the paintings, not someone pretending to see them like most people in this room." Maddie shook his hand, polite but careful. "Madeline, and thank you, I think." Tristan laughed and stepped a little closer. He began talking about the painting, the meaning behind the colors, the technique the painter used. Maddie listened, genuinely impressed by how much he knew, but she also realized he was flirting, in the way he angled his body toward hers, in the way his green eyes kept searching for her gaze. She glanced around for Callum and saw him speaking with a group of businessmen only a few steps away. But even while he talked, his eyes kept sliding toward her, and Maddie saw those eyes darkening with every second Tristan lingered too close. "Have you ever thought about learning to paint?" Tristan asked, and then he placed his hand on her arm, a familiarity she hadn't invited. "I could teach you, privately." Before Maddie could answer, a familiar voice appeared at her side. "You're taking too much of my girlfriend's time." Maddie startled. She hadn't heard Callum approach, hadn't felt his presence until he was already there beside her. Callum's voice was mild. It could almost have been called polite, but there was something in it that made Tristan go pale at once. The charming smile vanished, replaced by fear he tried to hide and failed. I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford," Tristan stammered, taking a step back. "I didn't know she was." He didn't finish. He only nodded quickly and disappeared into the crowd as if something were chasing him. Callum set a hand on Maddie's back, the familiar gesture, but this time there was something more possessive in it. He said nothing, only guided her onward to the next paintings, as if nothing had happened. As they passed a cluster of women whispering nearby, Maddie caught fragments of their conversation. "That's Callum Ashford, the Phantom," one whispered, her voice shaking. "I've heard no one dares touch what belongs to him." The other nodded with dark meaning. The last person who tried vanished without a trace. No one even found the body. Maddie went still, her steps slowing for a single beat before she forced herself to keep moving. The Phantom. She'd heard the name for the first time on her debut night, but then she hadn't paid attention. Now, hearing these fearful whispers, she began to understand why people looked at Callum with a mix of reverence and terror. The evening continued, but Maddie's mind was tangled with restless thoughts. When they left the gallery, Silas was already waiting outside. He stepped close to Callum and murmured something Maddie couldn't quite catch. She tried to pretend she wasn't listening, but her attention sharpened when she heard a few scattered words. "Walsh. Suspicious transactions. This week." Callum nodded, his eyes flicking quickly to Maddie. When he saw her watching, he ended the conversation with Silas at once and ushered her into the car. Inside, silence settled over them. Maddie stared out the window, trying to sort what she had just heard. Derek. Suspicious transactions. Callum was still watching him, but why? She decided to break the silence with a lighter question, trying to hide what she was really thinking. "Are you jealous?" she asked, half teasing, half serious, turning to look at Callum. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, and Maddie thought he would ignore the question. Then he spoke, his voice low and even. I protect what belongs to me. Maddie felt her heart speed up, but she didn't let it show. I don't belong to you, she said, her voice firmer than she intended. That's the agreement, remember? Callum turned and looked at her, eyes cutting through the darkness of the car. There was something in his gaze she couldn't read, something beyond his usual coldness. Yes, he said at last, his voice softer. The agreement. Then he turned away and looked out the window. Maddie turned away too, her heart beating in a wild rhythm behind her ribs. The phantom. Derek. Suspicious transactions. She was in the middle of something far bigger than she'd thought. And the most frightening part wasn't the secrets, wasn't the name Phantom, wasn't Callum's dark past. The most frightening part was that even knowing all of it, she still didn't want to leave. In the days after the gallery event, Maddie couldn't stop thinking about Callum's eyes when he said, I protect what belongs to me. She knew it was only an agreement, knew she was only a role in his life, but something in the way he looked at her, in the way he appeared at her side like a ghost the moment that artist touched her, made her heart refuse to obey logic. That night, the nightmares returned. Maddie hadn't had a nightmare in nearly 2 weeks, not since the night she'd heard Callum play the piano. She thought she'd escaped them, but she was wrong. In the dream, she was back in the old apartment with Derek. Everything was exactly the same as the worst nights of the past 3 years. The smell of whiskey, the heavy footsteps, the flickering light in the tiny kitchen. Derek stood in front of her, his face twisted with rage, his eyes bloodshot with drink. He moved closer and Maddie backed away until her spine hit the wall. No escape. There was never an escape. You think you can run from me? He snarled, his hand grabbing her throat and squeezing tight. You belong to me. Forever. Maddie couldn't breathe. She clawed at his hand, but he was too strong. Her lungs burned. Her vision began to blur. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Only darkness. Only fear. Only Derek's hand locked around her neck like a vice. Then she heard her name. Distant, as if from another world. Maddie. Maddie. She jerked upright with a scream, eyes wide in the dark, her heart pounding like a war drum. It took a few seconds to understand where she was. Not Derek's apartment. Her bedroom in Callum's penthouse. White sheets soaked with sweat. And Callum was there. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands gripping her shoulders, his face only inches from hers. In the dim light spilling in from the hallway, Maddie saw something she had never seen before. Callum's eyes were wild with worry, stripped of all coldness. For the first time she saw him lose control. The first time she saw real emotion on that steel-carved face. Maddie, he said her name, his voice tight. Are you all right? She didn't answer. She couldn't. Tears began to spill down her cheeks, and before she could think, she lunged toward him and clung to him as if he were the only life raft left in a storm. Callum went rigid. She felt the surprise in his body, the uncertainty, the not knowing what to do. He wasn't used to closeness, wasn't used to being needed like this. But then, slowly, his arms came around her. Not tight, not possessive the way his hand had been on her back in public. Just an embrace, gentle and steady. Maddie cried. For the first time since leaving Derek, she cried for real. Not silent tears in the night, but broken sobs. All the pain and fear she had held inside for so long finally shattering loose. Callum said nothing. He didn't hush her, didn't say it's okay the way people usually do. He simply stayed, solid and quiet, letting her cry until there were no tears left. When Maddie finally calmed, she pulled back, suddenly ashamed of her own loss of control. She wiped her face and couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice raw. I didn't know. Don't apologize, Callum cut in, his voice softer than she had ever heard. Silence settled over the room. Then he asked, so gently she almost didn't catch it. A nightmare about him. Maddie nodded, not needing to ask who him was. They both knew. He can't touch you anymore, Callum said, his voice firm as a vow. I promise. Maddie looked up and met the steel-gray eyes watching her, and she asked the question she had wanted to ask for a long time. The question she knew could shatter the fragile boundary between them. Why do you care? Callum didn't answer right away. He looked at her, and in that moment Maddie saw something strange cross his face. Not the familiar coldness, not perfect control. Confusion. For the first time, Callum Ashford, the Phantom, the most powerful man in Chicago, looked like someone who had no answer. "I don't know," he said at last, 3 simple words that weighed more than any confession. He looked down at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "I don't know why." Maddie watched him, her heart tightening. This was the first time Callum had admitted he couldn't control something. The first time he'd let her see a piece of the real man behind the steel mask. He stood, moved to the chair beside the bed, and sat down. "Sleep," he said, his voice a little closer to normal. "I'm here." Maddie wanted to protest, wanted to tell him he didn't have to do this, that she was fine, but her eyelids were heavy, her body exhausted after the crying, and deep down, she didn't want him to leave. She lay back and pulled the blanket to her chest. Her eyes found Callum's shape in the darkness, sitting silently in the chair like a night watchman. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she fell asleep without nightmares. When she woke the next morning, Callum was gone. The chair beside the bed was empty, as if the night before had been only a dream. But on the bedside table sat a hot cup of coffee, steam still curling softly upward. Maddie sat up and reached out to touch the warmth of the cup. And she knew, as surely as she knew she was breathing, that something had changed between them last night. A boundary had been crossed. A wall had been cracked open. There was no going back to the way it had been. She just didn't know whether that was good or bad. The 4th month passed, and everything between Maddie and Callum had changed in a way they both felt but neither of them put into words. After the nightmare, after he sat by her bed until morning, some invisible wall had collapsed. Their looks lingered longer, their silences became easier. Sometimes, over their shared breakfasts, Maddie caught Callum watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher, and when she looked back, he didn't look away the way he used to, but he still kept his distance. Not the coldness of the early days, but something else, as if he were fighting himself, holding back something he didn't want to admit. Maddie saw it, and she didn't know what to feel. Part of her wanted him to cross the line, wanted to know what would happen if they both stopped pretending. But another part, the part Derek had broken over 3 years, was still afraid of trusting anyone. That afternoon, Maddie needed to find Callum to ask about tonight's gala. Mrs. Brennan said he was in his study, but when Maddie reached it, the heavy wooden door was cracked open, and no one was inside. She meant to turn away, but her eyes swept the desk and stopped. A folder lay open on the surface, papers scattered around it as if someone had been in the middle of reviewing them. Maddie knew she shouldn't look. This would violate Clause 1 of their agreement. Never ask about Callum's work, but then she saw a name, printed in bold on the first page of the folder. Derek Walsh. Her heart missed a beat. She glanced down the hallway to make sure no one was there, then stepped into the study. Her feet moved as if they had a will of their own, carrying her to Callum's desk. She lifted the folder and began to read. What she saw made her blood turn to ice. It was a detailed investigative file on Derek Walsh. Every financial transaction he'd made in the past 18 months, every bank account, every expenditure, and in the center of the page, circled in red marker, was a number, $2,300,000. Beside it was a single word, embezzlement. Maddie turned the page, her hands trembling. The next pages were evidence. Lists of suspicious transactions. Money transferred from Pemberton financial accounts into secret accounts under false names. Derek was stealing millions of dollars from Harrison Pemberton, the kind man she'd met at dinner the month before, Callum's longtime partner, and almost a second father. Her mind spun, but she couldn't stop. She flipped to the next file, and what she saw stole her breath. It was a file on her. Full name, Madeline Cross. Date of birth, old address, previous workplaces, medical history. She saw notes about emergency room visits, diagnoses of fractured ribs, severe bruising, soft tissue injuries. Every time Derek had hit her was recorded here, detailed down to the dates. And in the corner of the page, there was a handwritten note in black ink. Domestic violence victim. 3 years. Could be useful. Maddie felt sick. She looked at the date on the documents, and her world collapsed. 2 months before the night she climbed into Callum's car. 2 months. He had known about her 2 months before they ever met. He had watched her, investigated her, known about her life with Derek. The night she thought fate had intervened. The night she believed she'd been lucky enough to jump into the one car that could save her. It had all been a lie. Nothing had been accidental. Nothing had been luck. She was only a piece on Callum Ashford's chessboard. "You found it," a voice said from the doorway, and Maddie whipped around. Callum stood there, leaning against the doorframe, eyes fixed on her without a blink. No surprise, no anger, only cold acceptance, as if he'd always known this moment would come. "You've been watching me." Maddie's voice shook, her hand still gripping the folder. "Before that night, before I ever got into your car." Callum didn't deny it. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. Yes, one word, a single word, and it shattered everything Maddie had built over 4 months. Every moment she thought was real. Every time she believed he cared. Every night he sat by her bed. It had all been built on a foundation of lies. "It was all a lie," she said, her voice breaking. "The agreement, the protection, everything. You used me to get to Derek." "Maddie." Callum took a step forward, but she stepped back, the folder slipping from her hands, papers flying across the floor. "I trusted you." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. I thought you." She couldn't finish. She didn't need to. They both knew what she meant. She thought he cared. She thought something between them was real. She thought she was beginning to fall in love with a man who couldn't love, and it had all been a lie. Maddie turned and ran out of the study, past Callum without looking back. She heard him call her name, but she didn't stop. She ran to her room, slammed the door, and finally let the sobs break loose. In the study, Callum stood alone amid the scattered papers on the floor. He stared at the door Maddie had fled through, and for the first time in many years, something like pain flickered across his steel-set face. He could have chased her. He could have explained, but he didn't, because he knew that no matter what he said, no matter how he explained, the truth was still the truth. He had used her, and now he would have to face the consequences. An hour passed like a waking nightmare. Maddie sat on the bedroom floor with her back against the bed, knees pulled to her chest. Her tears dried but still leaving faint tracks on her cheeks. She looked around the luxurious room she'd called home for 4 months, and suddenly everything felt foreign. The soft bed, the closet packed with expensive clothes, the design studio with its fabric and sewing machine. It was all part of a play Callum had staged, and she was nothing more than a puppet in his hands. She stood, pulled her travel bag from the closet, and started stuffing things into it. Not the costly dresses, not the diamond jewelry, only what she'd carried with her on the first night. The rain-soaked clothes that had been washed and folded neatly in a drawer, her old wallet, the phone she'd charged long ago. She would leave. No money, nothing from him. She'd survived before Callum Ashford, and she would survive after she walked away. A knock sounded at the door, light but unmistakable. Maddie froze, her hand still gripping the sweater she was about to shove into the bag. "Maddie." Callum's voice came through the door, no longer as cold as usual. "Give me 5 minutes. After that, if you want to go, I won't stop you." She stood there, motionless, wrestling with herself. Part of her wanted to scream, to tell him to get out, to tell him she didn't want to hear a single explanation. But another part, the part that had seen him play the piano at night, the part that had felt his arms around her after the nightmare, the part that had started to believe something between them was real, that part wanted to listen. She went to the door, drew a deep breath, and opened it. Callum stood there alone, with no sign of Silas anywhere. He wasn't wearing his usual suit, only a rumpled white shirt with sleeves rolled up and the collar open. The dark hair he normally slicked neatly back was slightly messy now, as if he'd raked his hands through it again and again. But what startled Maddie most was his face. The familiar steel mask was gone. The perfect control was gone. He looked tired, truly tired, with fine lines around his eyes she'd never noticed before. 5 minutes, Maddie said coldly, stepping back to let him in while keeping her distance. Callum crossed the threshold, his eyes flicking to the open bag on the bed, the few things she'd begun to pack. He didn't comment. He only turned back to her. Derek Walsh embezzled $2,300,000 from Harrison Pemberton over 18 months, he began, his tone steady but not cold. Harrison was my father's friend, the man who helped my family when my father died, when we had nothing but debt and enemies. He gave me my first opportunity, trusted me when no one else did. Maddie stayed silent, listening. She didn't want to be pulled into his story, but she couldn't deny that it explained a great deal. I monitored Derek to gather evidence, Callum went on. And in the process, I learned about you, about what he did to you, about the times you ended up in the emergency room and then went back to him, about 3 years of living in hell. He paused, eyes searching for hers. The night you showed up in my car wasn't an accident. I knew who you were the moment you said your name. Maddie felt anger rise in her chest. So it was all a trap, she cut in, her voice bitter. You lured me here, kept me here, all because of Derek. No, Callum shook his head. I could destroy Derek without you. Financially, legally, in every way. He's a small fish in my pond. I didn't need you to take him down. Then why? Maddie shouted, 4 months of buried emotion finally breaking loose. Why did you keep me? Why didn't you throw me out that first night? Why did you act like you cared? Callum was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was softer, almost gentle. Something Maddie had never heard from him before. Because that night, when you showed up in my car, bruised, terrified, soaked through to the bone, he stepped closer by a single pace, still keeping distance. You still looked me in the eye and demanded your own terms. You didn't beg, you didn't cry, you didn't plead for me to save you. You negotiated, with me, a man you didn't know, a man who could have killed you and no one would ever know, but you still demanded your rights. Maddie remembered that night, remembered telling Callum she wasn't a decorative doll, that she had the right to refuse. She'd been too scared to recognize how reckless she was then. I saw someone who refused to stay down, Callum continued, his voice nearly a whisper. Someone knocked down again and again who still got back up. Someone who deserved more than what he gave you. This agreement, at first, was about Derek. But it changed. I changed. How do I know you're not lying again? Maddie asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to control it. How do I know this isn't another performance? Callum moved closer, close enough that she could see every strand in his eyebrows, every line in that exhausted face. He stopped one step away and didn't come nearer. Are you afraid of me, Madeline? He asked, eyes fixed on hers. The question caught her off guard. She thought, truly thought, and the answer came to her clearer than almost anything in her life. No, she said, her voice steady. No, I'm not afraid of you. Then trust what you feel, Callum said softly, not what you think. Feelings don't lie, Maddie. Thoughts do. Silence filled the room, heavy and full of meaning. Maddie stood there with her hand still on the bag strap, not knowing what to do next. Part of her wanted to lift the bag and walk out, leave all of this behind, leave Callum Ashford and his dangerous world. But another part of her, the part she couldn't control, wanted to stay. I'll give you space, Callum said at last, stepping back. When you're ready, you know where to find me. He turned and walked to the door. Maddie watched his back, her heart pulled in 2 directions. The door closed softly, and she was alone in the room, her fingers still gripping the bag strap. She looked down at the bag, at the few things inside, at the door Callum had just passed through, and she understood one thing. She didn't lift the bag. A week passed after the fateful conversation in the bedroom. Maddie didn't leave. She had stood there for hours after Callum walked out, staring at the travel bag, fighting with herself. In the end, she set the bag down, opened it, and put her things back in the closet. She didn't know if it was the right decision or the wrong one, but she knew she wasn't ready to go. Not ready to lose what she and Callum had built, even if it had begun with lies. The next morning, she found Callum in his study. He sat behind the desk, staring out the window with a tired look, as if he hadn't slept either. When she stepped in, he turned, and for an instant, she saw something like hope flicker in those eyes. I'm staying, Maddie said, her voice steadier than she felt. But on one condition. Callum nodded, waiting. No more secrets, she said, meeting his gaze. About anything. I want to know everything. About Derek, about your plan, about the real reason behind all of this. If you want me here, I need to know where I stand on this chessboard. Callum was silent for a long time, studying her face as if weighing her. Then he nodded, a simple gesture that carried weight. No more secrets. And he kept his word. That week, Callum told her everything. About Derek embezzling money from Harrison Pemberton, about the evidence he'd gathered for more than a year, about the plan to expose him at Pemberton Financial's 30th anniversary gala. He explained that Derek needed to be taken down publicly, not only for the money, but for the betrayal of the man who had trusted him. Harrison deserved to know the truth, and Derek deserved to have his real face seen by everyone he'd deceived. The night before the gala, Maddie couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with thoughts of tomorrow. She would see Derek again. After 4 months, after everything that had happened, she would face the man who had turned her life into hell. And this time, she wouldn't run. At last, she gave up on sleep and got out of bed. She slipped on a thin cardigan and stepped onto the balcony, where the view swept across all of Chicago at night. The city spread below like a black cloth sewn with millions of diamonds. Lights glittered from the high-rises, from the busy streets, from cars sliding along like moving sparks. The night wind was cold, carrying the scent of coming rain and the faint echo of sirens far away. Maddie stood there with both hands on the railing, looking out at the city she'd called home for 4 months. She didn't hear Callum come close until he was beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body without being touched. They stood in silence, looking at the night city together. No one spoke for a long while, but this silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't need words to understand each other, the silence they'd learned over 4 months. "Are you afraid?" Callum asked at last, his voice gentle in the still night. Maddie thought before answering. She wasn't afraid of Derek, not anymore. She'd been afraid of him for too long, and now, standing beside Callum, she realized that fear had lost its grip. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just want it to be over. I want to know what it feels like not to have to think about him anymore." Callum nodded, his eyes still on the city. Then he said, his voice holding something Maddie couldn't name, "After tomorrow, you're free. Our agreement can end early. You don't have to stay longer." Maddie went still, her heart missing a beat. She had expected relief at those words, the freedom she'd craved for 4 months. But instead, her chest tightened with a sharp ache, as if someone had pulled all the air from her lungs. She didn't want it to end. The truth struck her with sudden clarity, like lightning in the night. She didn't want to leave this penthouse, didn't want to lose the quiet breakfasts and the nights with piano music, didn't want to leave Callum. "What if I don't want it to end?" she asked, her voice so small it was almost a whisper. She didn't know where the courage came from, but the words left her mouth before she could stop them. Callum turned to look at her, eyes searching in the darkness. He didn't speak. He didn't answer with words, but in the dark of Chicago's night, his hand found hers. His fingers threaded through hers, gentle but sure. This wasn't the hand-holding for public eyes, not a performance for strangers. This was the first time he reached for her on his own, the first time he let her see what he couldn't say aloud. Maddie felt her heart race, warmth flooding her veins. She squeezed his hand lightly, an answer without words. They stood there, hand in hand, looking out over the glittering city below. The night wind moved softly, carrying the whispers of distant streets. No one said anything more. No one needed to. Everything had been spoken through that touch, through the simple fact of them standing together in the night before the storm. Tomorrow, everything would change. Derek would be exposed. Their agreement would officially end, and both of them would have to face the reality of what they truly were to each other. But tonight, this moment, with Callum's warm hand in hers and the city lights shining like stars, tonight belonged to them. And that was enough. The Drake Hotel rose over the magnificent mile like one of Chicago's classic jewels. Tonight, the entire ground floor blazed with light to welcome Pemberton Financial's 30th anniversary gala. Hundreds of guests in evening wear streamed in, the city's most powerful business leaders, prominent politicians, celebrities, and Chicago's upper crust. This was the event of the year, the kind where an invitation alone was a privilege, and being greeted personally by Harrison Pemberton was an honor. Maddie stood before the mirror in the dressing room, looking at the unfamiliar woman staring back. The red gown clung to her body as if it had been poured onto her, the cut precise, shaping her figure in a way that was both seductive and commanding. Her hair was pinned up high, revealing the delicate line of her neck and diamond earrings that caught the light with every small movement. She was no longer the terrified girl running through the rain 4 months ago. She was a woman who had survived, who had fought, and tonight she would watch the man who had hurt her face the consequences. Callum appeared behind her in the mirror, flawless in a black tuxedo as always. But tonight there was something different, a tension in the way he stood, a particular brightness in his eyes as he looked at her. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Maddie turned and met his gaze. Ready. They entered the Drake's grand hall like a king and queen. Every eye swung toward them, whispers rising everywhere. Callum Ashford and his mysterious woman. Maddie felt the weight of those stares, but she wasn't as uneasy as she'd been in the beginning. She was used to this role now, and tonight she didn't need to perform. Her hand slid into Callum's naturally, not for the audience, but because she wanted to. They moved through the crowd, greeting familiar faces from past events. Maddie smiled, made conversation, played the perfect girlfriend with effortless ease, but her eyes kept sweeping the room, searching for one face. Then she saw him. Derek Walsh stood near the bar in a light gray suit that cost less than 1/10 of the suits around him. He held a drink, talking to a colleague, looking like an ordinary employee at a company party. But when his gaze skimmed the room and landed on her, everything shifted. Maddie saw his face change in an instant. Surprise, then recognition, then fury. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, and she recognized that look, the look she had feared for 3 years. Jealousy, hatred, possession. He set his glass down and started toward her. Maddie felt her body tense by instinct, but she forced herself to stay still. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't running anymore. Callum was speaking with Harrison Pemberton a few steps away, and Maddie knew he was watching, always watching. She could handle this. Derek stepped in front of her and blocked her path, close enough that she could smell the familiar whiskey on his breath, the scent that had haunted so many of her nights. "Maddie," he said, his voice trying to stay controlled but trembling with anger. "We need to talk. Alone." Maddie looked him straight in the eyes, and she was surprised to realize she wasn't afraid. "Not anymore." "There's nothing to talk about, Derek," she said calmly. His face twisted, and his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, squeezing hard enough to hurt. The old reflex made her want to flinch, but she resisted. "Who do you think you are?" he growled, his voice low and threatening. "Running off with that. Let go, now." Callum's voice came from behind Derek, soft as a passing breeze, sharp as a blade. Maddie saw Derek go rigid, as if someone had dumped a bucket of ice water down his back. He released her hand as if burned and turned to face Callum. And Maddie saw something she had never seen on Derek's face before. Fear. You are," Derek stammered, his face draining pale as he understood who stood in front of him. "Be careful with your next words, Mr. Walsh," Callum cut in, his voice still mild in the most frightening way. "There are a lot of ears listening." Before Derek could react, Harrison Pemberton appeared, his face pale and tight. Behind him were 2 men in dark suits with hard expressions, and Maddie recognized them at once. "Plainclothes police. Derek Walsh," Harrison said, his voice shaking with betrayal. "I've just received some very interesting documents about your transactions over the past 18 months. Derek turned, his face white as paper. He looked at Harrison, at the 2 officers, then back to Callum. And Maddie saw the moment he understood, the moment he realized he'd walked into a trap. Callum stood there, eyes cold as ice, and on his mouth was a small smile, the smile of a predator who has finally caught his prey. "You are under arrest for embezzling $2,300,000 from Pemberton Financial," one of the officers said, stepping toward Derek. The cold click of handcuffs sounded, metal closing around his wrists. "No," Derek screamed, struggling as they pulled him away. "Maddie." He twisted his head toward her, eyes red with rage and desperation. "You'll regret this. He's a monster. His voice faded as the police escorted him out of the hall and through a side door. The crowd buzzed, whispers rising everywhere, but Maddie didn't hear any of it. She stood there, staring at the door Derek had been taken through, and felt something strange inside her. Not fear, not pity, only emptiness, as if a piece of her had been cut away and thrown out. Then that emptiness slowly filled with something else. Relief. Like the stone she'd carried on her shoulders for 3 years had finally been lifted. Like the chains that had bound her had finally been removed. She was free. Truly free. Callum stood beside her, silent as a guard. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. But his hand found hers, their fingers lacing together, a gentle squeeze. Maddie squeezed back, and in that moment, standing beneath the blinding lights and the murmuring crowd, she understood a simple truth. It was over. Derek Walsh held no power over her anymore. 3 years of hell had truly, finally, ended. A week after the gala night, life in the penthouse returned to its strange quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind fragments that were slowly being cleared away. Derek Walsh was facing years in prison. The evidence of embezzling $2,300,000 stacked so high on the prosecutor's desk it couldn't be denied. Pemberton Financial was auditing the entire system, and Harrison Pemberton, though heartbroken by the betrayal, had sent his sincere thanks to Callum for protecting him from even greater losses. Maddie spent most of her time in the design studio, which she had turned into a small home of her own. Sketches covered the work table. Fabric swatches were pinned to the walls, and the ideas she had buried for 3 years were finally pouring out freely. She was working on the first collection for her own brand. 12 designs for women who were strong but still wanted to feel soft. Women like her. Women who had been knocked down and still stood back up. That afternoon, she was sketching the final dress in the collection when she heard familiar footsteps at the door. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. After 4 months, she had learned Callum's rhythm. The way he moved, the way he stood, the way he could fill a room with presence without saying a word. "You're busy," Callum said, not a question. Maddie set her pencil down and turned to him. He stood in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, steel gray eyes on her with something she couldn't name. It wasn't the coldness of the early days, and it wasn't the restraint she had grown used to. This was something else, something new, something that made her heart beat faster. "Not too busy," she said, rising to face him. Callum stepped into the studio, his gaze sweeping over the sketches on the table and the fabrics on the wall. Then he stopped a few steps away, and when he spoke, there was something different in his voice. "Our agreement can end now," he said, looking straight into her eyes. "Derek has been dealt with. You're free to go anywhere you want. The money is still yours. That's my promise. You can start a new life anywhere in this world." Maddie felt her heart tighten. She had known this moment would come, known that their agreement would end eventually. But she hadn't expected it to hurt like this, hadn't expected the thought of leaving Callum to feel like someone was tearing a piece out of her. "Do you want me to go?" she asked, her voice smaller than she meant it to be. Silence stretched. The longest silence they had ever shared. Callum looked at her, and she saw something fighting in his eyes. A battle between reason and feeling, between what he thought she should do and what he truly wanted. "No," he said at last, one simple word that weighed more than any speech. "But my world is dangerous. You deserve peace." Maddie stepped closer, closer than she had ever dared before. "I had peace with Derek," she said, her voice steady. "It nearly killed me. With you, I don't find peace. I find something else." She paused, searching for the right words for what she felt. "I find myself." Callum looked at her, and for the first time in all these months, he didn't hide. The steel mask fell away, revealing the real man beneath it, a man exhausted, bruised, and afraid in his own way. "I don't know how to love in the normal way, Madeline," he said, his voice roughening. "I don't know how to be soft. I don't know how to give someone what they need without hurting them. The world I live in doesn't make room for those things." Maddie lifted her hand and touched his face as gently as if she feared he would vanish. She felt the warmth of his skin beneath her palm, felt him close his eyes and lean into her hand like someone who had been thirsty too long and had finally found water. "I don't know how to be loved in the normal way either," she whispered. "Maybe we can learn together." Callum opened his eyes, steel gray searching hers, and then he kissed her. Not the kiss of an agreement, not a kiss for show in front of the world. This was real, slow, and careful as a question, as a plea for permission. Maddie kissed him back like an answer, like a promise. Their mouths met, warm and gentle, and in that moment, everything else disappeared. No agreement, no past, no Derek, no phantom, no anything. Only them, two broken people finding each other in the rubble. When they pulled apart, Maddie rested her forehead against his, eyes still closed. They stood like that for a long time, breathing in the same rhythm, feeling each other's heartbeat. Then she opened her eyes and saw Callum looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not the coldness of the phantom, not the control of the powerful man, just a man in love. They moved to the window, hand in hand, and looked out at Chicago in daylight. The city spread below like a vast map, busy and alive under the sun. Unlike the nights they had stood here before, watching the glitter of lights in darkness, today everything was bright and full of hope. "No more agreement," Maddie said softly. resting her head on his shoulder. "No," Callum agreed, kissing the top of her head. "Just us." Outside the window, the city of Chicago continued its rhythm, full of secrets and danger the way it had always been. But inside the penthouse on the 50th floor of Ashford Tower, two broken people were learning how to heal together. Maddie Cross, the girl who had once been knocked down by the man she loved, was now building her own dream with the support of a man the world called the Phantom, but she knew he was more than that. Callum Ashford, the most powerful man in Chicago, was now learning how to open his heart to a woman who had taught him that real strength doesn't live in control. It lives in the courage to love. This isn't the ending. This is the beginning. Real, imperfect, and completely theirs. Maddie and Callum's story reminds us that sometimes new beginnings come from the most unexpected places, that trusting again after betrayal is the bravest act a person can make, that we aren't defined by our past or by the scars life leaves behind, but by how we stand up and keep walking. And most of all, that true healing doesn't come from fighting alone, but from finding someone willing to walk through the dark with us. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss our exciting videos every day. Don't forget to like and share this video with the people you love to spread this meaningful message. We'd love to know how you feel about the story. Have you ever lived through a moment that made you think of Maddie? Do you believe in new beginnings? Leave a comment below and share what you feel deep in your heart with us. Every comment you leave is precious motivation that helps us keep bringing you even better stories. We sincerely thank you for taking the time to watch until the end of the video. We wish you and your family abundant health, a joyful life, and a peaceful spirit each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.